It's a real pleasure to be here. When I walked into this room, it reminded me of the first time I walked into this ballroom in 2013 when India hosted the first clean energy minister. I think they've hosted a second one since then. And it made me reflect on just how many times India shows up on the clean energy and climate global stage, and it's really nice to be back. I won't surprise you by acknowledging the uncertainty from the rapidly evolving political and policy landscape we find ourselves in. And in that landscape, very few things have remained constant. The need for finance to support countries' green growth trajectories, protecting their citizens and their future generations from the worst impacts of climate change, that has remained. And speaking of climate impact and future generations, as was mentioned, I'm the president of Sequoia Climate Foundation. We are a global climate foundation focused on investing in the deepest and fastest levers to avoid the worst impacts of climate change for this and future generations. Not to be confused with Sequoia Capital, but in that context and at Sequoia, we think a lot about scale. And on scale, the scale of financing the scale of financing gap that remains is quite significant. It stands at $1.6 trillion of annual clean energy investment. That's what's needed for emerging and developing economies by 2030. That is a 5x increase from 2022 levels. And this is despite what we've heard from leaders and their commitments to mobilizing climate finance and MDB reform. And we don't suffer from a dearth of MDB recommendations, and we're going to get to that on our panel. This is in the backdrop of growing fiscal constraints on the multilateral system, and this underscores the importance of multilateral finance effectively mobilizing private finance. Public financial institutions can be smarter about private sector development, including by adapting their financing toolkit, things like guarantees and more equity, and applying stronger conditionalities on large corporates seeking to access their debt and equity financing. These elements raise a couple of questions that we're going to encounter on our panel today. Things like how the existing multilateral framework can adapt to meet this moment, and whether it's necessary to create new institutions, be they domestic, bilateral, or multilateral, with new mandates, financing strategies, and governance frameworks. So these are a few things I'd like to explore with our esteemed panel. I first wanted to turn to Mr. Singh. As I mentioned, we are not short on recommendations on what needs to be done, including those that you submitted to the G20 as co-convener of the Independent Expert Group on MDB reform. So my questions to you are, what is blocking the needed action, and what has to be shifted based on the rapidly changing political environment from those recommendations that you submitted?
Well, thank you very much. Let me say that it's a great pleasure and privilege to me to be part of this very distinguished panel. Apart from the enormous work which you and your organization is doing, I find all my old friends here, H.L. Gorea, she has traveled all the way carrying the message of Mia Motley, who remains one of the most articulate speakers for the Global South. And this is widely acknowledged that the contribution of the Bridgetown Initiative under her leadership has been a very, very positive abiding factor in terms of the reform of the international financial architecture. And of course, to you, we have been interacting for a number of years on a number of issues, so it's a great pleasure to be with you here. You asked a very pointed question, and I'll give you a pointed reply. Let me say that I think that during last year, during the G20 presidency of India, which was greatly and enormously carried forward by the presidency of Brazil, and South Africa is also doing it. India was lucky to inherit enormous contribution from Turkey, when under the G20 presidency, the famous report on the Capital Adequacy Framework report, which enables a significant enhancement of the capacity of the multilateral development banks without necessarily infusion of additional capital. I think that it has been a happy coincidence. The 4 countries of the South have each succeeded each other from Indonesia to India to Brazil and then to South Africa. These 4 countries from the South represented in many ways the aspirations and the quest of the South countries in seeing a reform of the multilateral development banks to significantly do, I guess, 3 important things: to substantially enhance their own lending capacity. And what we ended up in doing in our second report, if I'll tickle your memory for a second, we decided to call the second report Better, Bolder, and Bigger. Those issues remain a dominant concern. The dominant concern really is that, as I'm sure my colleague will point out, that it's grossly inadequate to address the financial needs of the orderly climate transition. What is accomplished in the last COP was an important gain, but perhaps there's a long way to go. But now, in the changing configuration of the geopolitics and the geopolitical configurations, we must ask ourselves exactly the question which you asked: do we need new institutions, or can we do by restructuring old institutions? Now, there are 2 ways in which I will give you a very short answer, and I'll be happy to interact. I think that the chances of it becoming better remain quite high. The multilateral development banks can become better in terms of reducing the project processing time, in each of them acting not in silos, but acting in tandem with each other, in substantially being able to harness and optimize the balance sheet, and finally, in being able to optimize the outcome from each other's learning experience. So I think that better, there is a good chance. Bolder in terms of an enhanced capacity to take risks. Exactly what are the questions which have been posed by the background notes for today's session? Really, how to harness private capital much more imaginatively than the MDBs have been able to do. That has been a point of lingering failure. And I'm sure that you will agree that considering the responsibilities which currently you have in taking the Bridgetown initiative further, harnessing of private capital, mitigating risks, regulatory risks, foreign exchange risks, encouraging the use of local currency, and many more ways, there is a daunting challenge ahead. Finally, chances of it becoming bigger in the final resort will require really recapitalization of these institutions in some measure or the other. That's something on which I have a bit of a concern, considering some of the developments. So what do I say as my final sentence on this one? You know, just as institutions must adopt, they must be pragmatic too. And I think that I feel that mercantilist multilateralism should not be an anathema. It is already a mercantilist multilateralism in multiple ways, considering that the shareholders do exercise their preferences on the manner and modality in which multilateral institutions should continue with their lending operations. So making them more pragmatic, if you like, multilateralist, or transactional multilateralism should not be such a global anathema. That can be a message which we can carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So it sounds like better, bolder, and bigger stays. We're just thinking about change underneath those. I'm going to move on to Ambassador Dolago. some of the Global South leadership was mentioned by Mr. Singh. And certainly Brazil has played a leadership role in the COP and G20 processes last year and this year. And I'm curious for the role that Brazil can play in enhancing the effectiveness of multilateral finance. And is there anything regarding the governance and limited representation on Global South that you want to comment on?
Well, I also want to start by saying that I'm delighted to be this panel, and Christy, it's great to be under your leadership here. Complementing what Nk said, I would like to stress that we have to think bigger, as you were saying, because we received a mandate in Baku. Brazil and Azerbaijan have to present at COP30 a roadmap to go from 300 billion to 1.3 trillion. So the role of the MDBs, we all know, is going to be very important, but we're talking about enormous sums. And it reminds me of the stories that we have to be very careful to see in which circumstances we are and what do we have to do differently. And I think that we kept an idea of a very successful UN convention, which is the Ozone Layer Convention and the Montreal Protocol, that could solve 95% of the issue of the ozone layer through a convention, a protocol, because they had the appropriate finance, technology transfer. And in the beginning, we all thought that for climate change, maybe this was going to be the solution. That's why we had the convention, we had the protocol. But the fact is that we saw quickly that climate change affects all sectors of the economy. So the scale is infinitely bigger than the ozone layer. So when we have such a bigger scale and when we see that it is affecting even geopolitics, we have to think that we need new instruments. We are not going to get 1.3 trillion with the instruments that we are used to use. So I think that there is an expression that is the last war mentality, that militaries prepare for war thinking of the previous war. We need to think that we are in a completely different context in which we have an exponential risk, new risks related to climate change, and exponential resources related to technological revolution that we are living. So we have to think of that 1.3 trillion and the role of the MDBs in this larger context in which we have to somehow mainstream climate into the economy, mainstream climate into investments, and not do the opposite, not think that it is funds or that it's going to be localized discussions. No, we have to incorporate climate into the economy. And I think that this is probably a very exciting dimension, and this started somehow thanks to Barbados, because the Bridgetown Initiative, followed by the Paris meeting, the 4 Ps, followed by Nairobi meeting, and followed by groundbreaking work like the Triple Agenda. We had also in our G20, I think, a very interesting report on climate change and finance. So I think we're opening new doors and not reducing the discussion of climate finance into what would be like a fund mentality that I think has to be overcome.
Thank you. I think, as you said yourself, that's an excellent segue to Dr. Barduil and Barbados. Prime Minister Motley, as many of us know, has spearheaded a lot of the political efforts around MDB reform. She's done an amazing job of raising the public profile with developing and developed leaders alike. There has been progress, but there's much to do. I would love to hear what's next for the Bridgetown Agenda, for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and the V20 finance ministers, all where Barbados and Minister Motley are playing a leadership role.
Thank you so much. It's never easy to come on the last day of a meeting. It's very difficult to follow on the words Prime Minister Mia Moore-Motley. And also it's not just a pleasure and a privilege, but really, I think coming on the heels of literal and figurative giants, right? Honorable N.K. Singh, you've spoken about the work of the G20 on the capital adequacy framework. You've spoken about the broader reform agenda, which I think is incredibly relevant. I'm not going to speak about that. I'm going to go into other aspects of the Bridgetown Initiative that perhaps we're less well known for. And Andre, if I may, I think your points around integration are key. So it's not just SDGs and climate together in investment, it's also nature. And I think it's also recognizing that while the Bridgetown Initiative has quite the profile, we're part of a number of initiatives that are reinforcing each other, and you've spoken of them just now. I think one of our advantages is that because we're not an institution and we don't have a membership, we have maybe the luxury of saying things that don't have to be negotiated, that we can throw out there and therefore have a little bit more wiggle room to say things that are perhaps thought-provoking and difficult for others. So a few things. The numbers, and I'll share some data points of what's needed, $1.3 trillion, of which 400 billion is an additional sum for adaptation. We're not even speaking of loss and damage. For context, I come from Dominica, an island that lost $1.2 billion overnight, 226% of our GDP in 2017, following the passage of a Category 5 hurricane. So we have all of that as context. But I think what's really missing from the discussion right now is true country ownership and agency. There's a supply side problem. The resources are not there currently in sufficient volumes. But unless and until we take ownership of the agenda and start to look under the sofa, behind the chairs, behind the carpet, for the resources that we can catalyze, I think we'll very much be at the mercy of an increasingly tight environment where the resources aren't just going to drop out of the sky. So this is all tied to at least three agendas. One is the trade agenda. So on the flip side of the development finance agenda is the trade agenda. You don't grow your economies on the back of development finance alone. You grow it on the back of trade rules and maybe the undoing of legacy systems which are extremely extractive, that don't support domestic value addition, that don't support the investment that's needed in infrastructure, as well as cultural systems domestically. We have many countries that invest in trade back and forth, small-scale trade, but not in long-term infrastructure, which is really the backbone of the growth agenda. I think the second point is debt. So debt is not just countries that are drowning, and many are, right? So the African continent, just for context, has $285 or so billion in debt. The debt service in 2025 alone will be $88 billion. So you can run the numbers. It's in excess of 10% debt that you're paying. And that's significant. But again, until and unless we change the debt sustainability analysis framework, because we're going to need to continue to borrow to invest in all of these things, until we look at the benefits of investing in the SDGs, of investing in adaptation, investing in nature resilience, and the returns that come economically from that, then you will continue to be told that you do not have borrowing headroom. So if you don't have borrowing headroom, how are you going to solve these problems? And then I think the third point is the ODA agenda, and I'm just going to go through a few more. ODA in 2022, and we all know this has declined since, was $223 billion, of which the African continent got $60 billion. Remember I said Africa is paying $88 billion in debt service compared to $60 billion in ODA. So clearly that's a little bit off kilter, and I think relying on ODA to solve our problems, again, as a global south, is not a good move. So what can we rely on? We can rely on debt as investment. So again, some numbers. Barbados, and I had the privilege of leading Barbados' investment plan to 2025 to 2035. It's a 10-year plan. Barbados is a country of 280,000 people, very small. Our investment plan is around $12 billion over the next 10 years, and Barbados' GDP is $6 billion. So that's doubling our GDP and investment over 10 years. Interestingly, 60% of that investment will come from the private sector. 40 comes from the public sector. So how do you get that private sector investment going? Absolutely enabling environment, but there's a few concrete things that we're pushing on the Bridgetown Initiative. The first is quite simply, domestic resource mobilization. So you cannot expect foreign investors to come if you're not investing in your own economies. There's space for foreign investors in terms of bringing skills, technology, knowledge, but they're not going to take risk unless you reward them for that risk. And in many places, the private sector domestically is a better place to do that. I'll be super
One
quick.
more thing.
Yes, just one more thing. So local currency. How are we scaling up local currency? And how are we scaling up, to be frank, local taxation, which I think India has done very well. One last thing is on debt swaps. Out of that $12 billion, about $1 billion, a little bit under 10%, we would be able to get domestically from debt swaps, swapping out that expensive debt that's 10+% for cheaper debt. And I'm happy to talk more about that after perhaps Angel has had a chance to jump in.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about new instruments, as an ambassador said, so I'm glad you mentioned the swap. I'd now like to turn to Mr. Gurria. Pep mentioned that there are a couple sides to the coin, right? Agency from countries and also supply side. I wanted to talk to you and get your opinion on the adequacy of resources going into the multilateral development banks. What can be done, noting the withdrawal of US climate finance?
Well, first of all, I got bad news for you, because the needs just jumped from 100 billion, which was kind of the magical number that we had to arrive to, and now it's 300 billion. And now over the next 4 years to 2030, it's 1.3 billion or something like that. I have to say that this jump becomes quite impossible with the idea that you add Mr. Trump to the equation. That means that without necessarily having Mr. Trump withdraw from the World Bank or withdraw from the IMF, simply the new logic, the new way will make it very, very difficult. Now, there is a way, however, and that is to follow the experts group recommendation. That is to leverage. First of all, increase the capital, but then leverage it more. Now, how much do you leverage it? Well, banks, commercial banks leverage it like 10 times. Let's say 5 times for multilateral development banks. Okay, that would cover the difference between 100 billion and 300 billion. That means with just one single solution, you could cover the rest, and you would not be even halfway to what the commercial banks do. Now, remember that you also have to provide 100 billion of aid. That means non-reimbursable loans to the poorest countries in the world. So you have quite a way to go, and the way to do it is precisely by allowing a higher leverage, and that would allow what you call the cross subsidy, which is to get the people who pay the full interest of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, etc., and be able to finance the part that goes to non-reimbursable, because it's out of the profits. So in a way, it is a transfer, it's a subsidy of the, let's say, more developed countries in the developing countries, India, and Brazil and Mexico, etc., to the poorest countries in the region. So it can be done, it's possible. So the very bad news that I have can be solved with being very practical and having simply do what the multilateral banks should do halfway through which the commercial banks do.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave that last question open and throw it to the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes left. We're going to start with the Raisina Young Fellows in the back. So please go ahead and ask your question to the panel.
Thank you so much. Namaste, I'm Sunita from Nepal, and my question goes like this. How can reform multilateral finance mechanism can ensure that indigenous and traditional knowledges from the vulnerable communities is incorporated into the climate finance decision? Thank you.
What was the last thing you said? Into the climate finance, what? I didn't catch it.
The last sentence, the climate finance decision.
Okay. I am open to whatever panelist would like to take that question.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to sort of answer it and then sneak in something else. Okay, so how can this be incorporated? Look, I think, again, this starts with country ownership. To what extent is the investment plan of a country factoring in traditional, indigenous, gender-based elements? If it doesn't start on the countryside, then it's unlikely that external institutions are going to be able to reflect it. So my quick answer would be to make sure that any government that's leading conversations with development partners has incorporated this into their investment planning process. But because you're from Nepal, may I just take 1 minute to add a response? I don't know if anyone here was in the room yesterday. There was a really interesting panel on adaptation financing. And the Minister, I think, of Foreign Affairs of Nepal reached out and mentioned 2 points, which I didn't get the chance to speak on. One was on the insurance industry, and the other was on debt swap. So I'm going to take, since I have the mic, the liberty of answering. On the Bridgetown Initiative side, those are 2 areas that we're spending a lot of time focusing on this year. And in advance of the Financing for Development Summit, we'll come out with very tangible recommendations. I don't like to say papers or reports. These are recommendations for action. The first is that the insurance industry has $40 trillion in assets. That's an awful lot of assets. And where are those assets located? To what extent are those built in a way that are supporting the resilience agenda? The second thing is that the insurance industry, and I think to the colleague who just spoke, also has a range of products, but those products are not always designed to support the needs of sovereigns or the needs of individuals. Again, this could be traditional, indigenous people, but it's also small and medium-sized enterprises. So to what extent do they have products designed for this? And the final thing is that if there's one thing insurers know how to do, it's to assess risk. Are we leveraging the full power of the insurance industry in developing our own risk-adjusted investment plans? The second point that the minister mentions was debt swaps. I spoke to this earlier. Quick example. Barbados has done 2 debt swaps. First, debt for nature swap 3 years ago, and just a few months ago, we closed on a debt for climate swap, which is the world's first. We're in the process of doing a debt for social swap, as well as a regional debt swap. So we're really ahead of the curve on swaps, but this is not knowledge that every country has, and it's experience that has to be built. Numbers. We swapped $300 million in debt and saved $130 million over 10 years in interest payments. That's a lot of money for a small country, especially 130 million over 300 million. That's a great savings. And that money is going into investing in climate resilient projects, specifically in the sanitation and agricultural sector. But what does it take tangibly, and for any development partners in the room, please hear me on this, to scale these swaps? So it's not just Barbados or Ecuador or Belize doing a swap here and there, but that this is happening across the V20 countries. It takes three things: technical assistance support into the governments, guarantees for those swaps to be able to leverage the private capital markets, including the domestic markets, and trust. Trust on the part of partners that you have the projects that can absorb those savings.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's really helpful. I wanted to ask you about the learnings from the first of a kind swap in Barbados. So thank you for sharing that. Let's go to another question on either side. Let's go over here.
My name is Krutat. I'm a student from ICI. My question is something like this. There was a report of Ernst & Young, according to which India is needing around US dollar 150 to 200 billion dollars in order to fulfill its NDCs, and it represents approximately 4 to 6% of India's GDP. So, and currently the level of investment which is available is only 25% of the goals. So, how is India going to finance the other goals, or what fiscal policies and plans should it adopt?
Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Singh, if you'd like to take that. I wanted to ask about the Indian National Green Financing Body responding to the failure of MDBs anyhow. And so I don't know if you would like to respond to that question, incorporating that in your answer.
Make one or two very brief comments on some of the suggestions made by my co-panelists here. I entirely agree with your comment about climate financing becoming not an add-on. Proof of pudding would be in the eating. You know, the World Bank from its inception and the multilateral development banks in general have had two important objectives: poverty alleviation, poverty elimination, and shared prosperity. For the first time, last year, they added poverty elimination, shared prosperity in livable planet. That is the first recognition, and you know that. I hope that continues. And I'm waiting anxiously for the caption of the spring report on the state of the global economy, which will be out in April. So that is going to be pretty central. I agree with you, Angel, about leveraging. That's our recommendation 19. Currently, would you be surprised that $1 of outlay by the bank results in 0.6, not even 1. Not even 1. Far away from 1. $1 leading to 0.6. So I think that that's a long, therefore, margin to go. But what will that take? That will require a different culture change. You will have to have a different method in which the managerial skills, incentive structures of the bank works. Not to work as public sector entities in settled complacency, but to go out and to actively be able to seek private capital and leverage. One last comment. I totally agree with you that on the creative use of the Resilience and Trust Fund, on the SDR, very little has been done so far. The Resilience and Trust Fund of the International Monetary Fund has garnered some, but has a long way to go. And finally, let me therefore say to the question which was answered so brilliantly by you, but if I may add, our recommendation number 1 in the group was building up robust country platforms and country ownerships to increase substantially the pipeline of bankable projects. And I hope that, therefore, does not require too much political support, but it does require a mindset change or the working of the multilateral development banks. I don't know if I have addressed your question, but those are some of the responses.
I think that's helpful. I'm going to see if we have...
to your left.
Sorry, I'm going to have time for... Yes, let's do one final question, and then I'll try to incorporate our two other speakers in the answer here. So, go ahead.
Good evening, panelists. I'm Sampurna, and my question is posed for the COP30 president. Sir, given the ICJ's advisory opinion on the climate obligations of different states, should countries that have historically contributed the most to climate change be subject to legally binding reparations? What is your view on the same? And if that is so, how would you navigate the diplomatic tensions this could create?
Did you catch it? I heard, I don't know if everyone heard, but I heard there's...
No, I'm sorry, because the speakers are directed to you. The speakers are not directed to us, and I couldn't understand the question. So,
should I repeat the question?
Just the last bit, the last question.
The last question is, if there are legally binding reparations on the states that have contributed the most to climate, contributed the least to climate obligations, I'm sorry, how would you navigate the diplomatic tensions this could create?
Legal reparations, if those required, how would you navigate the diplomatic tensions that would create?
yeah, navigating is a very positive word for what we're going to have to do. But no, there are issues that have been partially covered by the creation of the loss and damage, because loss and damage fund has admitted that the countries that had contributed less to climate change are the ones that are suffering more because of climate change. So at least there was a philosophical recognition. It's already a progress. Now, from the philosophical to really bringing to these countries what they deserve to be able to counter climate change, unfortunately, is still very complex. And we come back very often as developing countries to the historical responsibilities of countries and how much should these historical responsibilities be activated for us to find the appropriate funds for that. So this is going to be hard to navigate, but I'm very glad that you raised it here so that people know that my job is not going to be easy.
Maybe I can pick up that question for a final question to you, Mr. Gurria. And I want to lean in on this global south and global north tension, which is expressed by our last question. And there is a discussion around the tension between development and climate finance. And I would like to know from your perspective, are they in competition? Are they complementary? So development and climate finance. And I think that speaks to, I think, the sentiment and the spirit of the last question, maybe done in a more diplomatic way.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to thank the Club de Madrid for sponsoring me, for taking the floor today. But listen, they are absolutely complementary. Development finance and climate finance, one goes together hand in hand with the other. You cannot imagine that they would go separate ways. And you cannot imagine what would happen if a country does not invest, and I use the word invest very, very appropriately and very deliberately. Invest in climate finance, because otherwise, the single most important intergenerational responsibility that we have is with the planet. And if we do not respect that intergenerational responsibility, we're going nowhere. And we will soon find out, sooner rather than later. We are already looking at the consequences of that. And therefore, you know, with the floods, and sometimes you have floods and you have fires and in the same country, you know. And so basically, I would say it is a false dilemma, and you absolutely have to go hand in hand and get the finance. But as I said before, it is doable, it is possible, but we have a new element in the horizon, which is Mr. Trump. And I believe we have to deal with that situation. And maybe the way to do it is to show a bit greater unity among everybody else in order to show whoever does not want to join that the way to do it is precisely to do it united, because unfortunately pollution does not have borders.
Thank you. I think you're right that the leaders on this panel have a role to play in figuring out how to make that indeed complementary.
Could we squeeze in one last question? I'm so sorry. I'll be very quick.
I think our time is up, unfortunately. I'm so sorry. I did my best to get all three corners of the room. Thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate your interventions and best thinking.
Thank you.